Mr. Walsh, Mr. Consadine, thank you for accepting the invitation to the Finance Committee. Can I ask you both, do you believe that you are exclusively bound by company law in your role as directors of Bank of Ireland?
Well, that's the legal position, but the reality of life is that, and this was made clear in the 2010 legislation, that the overriding responsibility of directors, including public interest directors, is in the public interest.
Mr. Consadine?
That's correct.
Would you accept then that you can breach company law if it is in the public interest, according to the Act that you refer to, Mr. Walsh?
Well, I haven't breached the law, thankfully, up to now. I don't think I'm going to start this hour of my life. In other words, the public interest is what I'm concerned about, and the public interest concern is what I bring to bear in deliberations at board level, and as I have sought to demonstrate that over the last 3 years or so, that Bank of Ireland has been a responsible bank in the context of the Irish economy and its development over that period of time.
Thank you. And where there is a conflict between the interests of the bank and the interests of the public, do you agree that the interests of the public supersede your legal obligations towards the interests of the bank?
Well, Deputy, I think that's, that depends on how you define the public interest. We have had a number of...
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Regardless of how you define it, my question says, when you perceive that there is a conflict between the public interest and the interests of the bank, when that is the case, regardless of how you define the public interest, do you agree that your duty to act in the public interest supersedes your duty to act in the interests of the bank?
Section 48 of the Credit Institution Stabilisation Act 2010 provides that the overriding duty of the covered institutions relates to the public interest as set out in the Act.
Thank you. Can you answer the question?
What's the question? Sorry.
The question I just asked you. Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
The question is, where you perceive that there is a conflict between the public interest and the interest of the bank covered under your obligations under company law, do you agree that your legal position is that you should act in the public interest even though it might be contrary to the interests of the bank?
If the situation is covered by Section 48, then it is quite clear that the law is that the overriding duty of the covered institutions relates to the public interest. And quite frankly, Deputy, I will always make sure that I operate within the law.
Mr. Walsh, did I hear in response to Deputy Spring earlier, did I hear correctly that you said that previous directors of the Bank of Ireland are not in any way responsible for the collapse of the bank?
No, you didn't.
Oh, thank you. So within the context of public interest versus the interest of the bank, I'd like to come on to the personal insolvency legislation. As I'm sure you're both aware, it is Minister Shatter and the government's very clear intent that there would be debt forgiveness as part of the personal insolvency legislation. Mr. Boucher is reported in the newspapers for Monday as, quote, categorically ruling out reducing a portion of the personal debt of any of its customers. Can you tell me what your position is? Do you agree with Mr. Boucher, or as public interest directors do you disagree with his position?
First of all, in relation to the legislation, when the legislation is on the statute book, as the Bank of Ireland will abide by it, of course, and that is the position, and that's always the position in relation to any piece of legislation that's put on the statute book. In relation to how we deal with stressed mortgages, there is a structure in place which...
I'm very short in time, and I don't need you to describe the process. The question I'm asking is very specific. The personal insolvency legislation foresees Bank of Ireland engaging in debt forgiveness. Mr Boucher on Monday has categorically ruled out the Bank of Ireland doing that. Do you, as public interest directors, agree with Mr Boucher's position or oppose it in this instance?
I think basically what Mr Boucher is talking about is consistent with the bank adhering to the terms of the new legislation when it comes in. I mean, essentially, we have a structure in place which is overseen by the central bank, and we will follow that structure and deal with mortgage arrears under that structure. And at the end of...
With respect, I have very little time. Can you please answer the question I have directed at you?
That is the only way I can answer it, Deputy. I'm trying to be helpful.
Let me ask the question once more then, for clarity. The personal insolvency legislation, which was voted through all stages in this House last night, foresees, Minister Shadow is on the record as saying that he foresees debt forgiveness as part of that legislation. The Chief Executive of Bank of Ireland has publicly, categorically ruled out any such debt forgiveness. Do you, Mr Consadine, and you, Mr Walsh, as public interest directors, support Richie Boucher's categorically ruling out debt forgiveness as part of the engagement with the personal insolvency legislation?
What I am saying to you is this, that there is a rational process for dealing with mortgage arrears in the Bank of Ireland, and that is being worked through, and that when the legislation comes into effect, we will abide by the legislation the same as...
I appreciate that, but that is not answering the question I'm asking you.
I can't.
And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to let you stonewall me on this. You are public interest directors. It is relevant and reasonable for me to ask you whether or not you agree with Richie Boucher's position on this most critical of issues.
Boucher is the servant of the board. That's simple. Boucher is the servant of the board. Fact, law.
Basically, as I said to you, there is a structure. We will work through that structure. We will abide by the terms of the new legislation when it's on.
Well, it's the law. I'm not asking you whether or not you will abide by the law.
Yeah, but I know that.
Can you direct?
I'm just going to make an intervention here because, unfortunately, this is reflecting a similar situation we had with Bank of Ireland when before us in the past. What Deputy Donnelly is asking, and he's not asking about blanket debt forgiveness. What he's asking about is on case-by-case basis in situations where people cannot meet the full sum of their mortgage, regardless of any forbearance that can be given to them. Will there be situations where there will be debt adjustment, debt write-off, or debt write-down, whatever vernacular or vocabulary we actually apply to it, or debt forgiveness? Will Bank of Ireland, because that's what the personal insolvency legislation is about. It's about getting people out of difficulties that are in the present and get them functioning back in the economy. There are people in despair in this country who cannot see daylight on the horizon because of debt that is actually shouldered upon them at this moment in time. The question that has been put to you this morning, Mr Consadine, and which has been pointed out by Deputy Matthews, that the CEO of the bank is a servant of the board. Do you, as public interest directors, envisage a situation where people who are in insurmountable debt will be able to avail of the insolvency legislation and have some of that debt lifted off their shoulders?
Well, Deputy Chair, I think that the answer that I'm giving to the question is a reasonable one. The job of the board is to put in place a structure for dealing with the debt.
I'm interested in the board, Mr Consadine. I'm interested in your role as a public interest director, what you're going to do. And you're not going to stonewall this committee. What are you doing as a public interest director on this matter? Don't talk to me about the board. Do not talk to me about the CEO. Tell me what you're doing as a public interest director on this matter and stop stonewalling the committee.
I'm making sure that there is a structure in place which will operate the new legislation when it comes in. And where individuals have debts that are unmanageable, then it is a matter for the executive of the bank to deal with that within the structure that we are putting in place. I'm a non-executive director.
I can read out the rules of what a non-executive director is, and I'll read them to you. I have them here. Just give me one moment. A non-executive director, I'll read it to you. A non-directive executive is a director who does not have a contract of service with the company and normally serves the company on a part-time basis. Your role is that you were not actually elected to the board, you were appointed by the Minister of the day and have been there for the last 4 years. As a non-executive director, you will have a management function in the running of the business other than assisting in the deliberations of the board. You actually have a running function as a non-executive director. You direct how the bank actually operates. Nonetheless, your legal powers and duties are identical to those of executive directors, and for this reason you should ensure that you have the same ability to obtain information from within the company as other directors. Even though in practice you may use mainly summarised information submitted in reports to the board. So how you gather the information which you make your decisions can be in detail or in summary. More specifically, you have a duty of care and which is required by both executive and non-executive directors. You have a duty of care. In your situation, your duty of care is in reference to being a public interest director. And your duties as a non-executive director will be intermittent, and as a result, you are not expected to give the same continuous attention to the company's affairs as that given by other executive directors. We accept that. But you are there, both of you, having been well remunerated for 4 years to the tune of €500,000 each. I'm asking you this afternoon, on behalf of this committee, what are you doing in the public? You were servants of the state at Brayton on this board. I can pull out all the information here, where it says quite specifically, your duty under the legislation is owed by the directors, your duty to the minister on behalf of the state. That's why you're in there. And your duty takes priority over any other duty that you have as a director, even if it becomes inconsistent with the duty of the bank. That's what it is. There is legislation that will be passed in this House where people are hanging in there by their fingernails, hoping for some hope. I'm not interested in what Bank of Ireland are doing. I'm interested in what you're both doing in terms of that legislation, and this is what this committee wants to hear. And I'm sorry for interjecting upon this, but we have arrived at the kernel of your roles and responsibilities. Can you please answer and tell us what you're doing?
But Deputy, the Bank of Ireland, basically there's 90% of our mortgages are performing. I mean, that is a fact.
And I know that half the residential property in this country does not even have a mortgage on it. But what we're talking about is those people who are in distress.
Yeah, but I can't talk for the whole industry. What I'm talking for is Bank of Ireland. And the fact of the matter is that...
I want you to talk about your role. Stop talking about the bank and stop talking about the general industry. I want you to talk about your role as a public interest director. I'm sorry.
Could we ask Mr. Walsh to say?
Yes, and we will. But please, stop stonewalling the committee and tell us about what you're going to do in this instance as a public interest director. I'm sorry, but I really have to push this question on behalf of the committee.
And the kernel of it is whether or not you support Mr. Boucher's position. That's the kernel, because, Chair, this personal insolvency legislation is where the public interest and the interests of the bank are in conflict. The whole point of the two of you is when the public interest and the interests of the bank are in conflict, the legislation allows you, in fact the legislation compels you to act in the public interest. Mr. Boucher, his position is contrary to the spirit of the personal insolvency legislation, and therefore the public interest in this case is defined by the government.
To give the two public interest directors an opportunity to answer this question. If they fail to do so, we're going to move on. But it will be acknowledged.
And so specifically, Chair, it's whether or not Mr. Walsh, Mr. Consadine, you support Mr. Boucher's position as he stated this week. That's the crux of it.
And we'll come back to Mr. Consadine.
Yeah, firstly, the insolvency legislation went through the House last night. I haven't seen the legislation itself, but what I can say categorically is that Bank of Ireland will adhere and comply with the provisions of that legislation. And I will, as a public interest director, make sure that that happens. And if that means that when all avenues have been exhausted in terms of people in distressed mortgages, well then, if a loan is irrecoverable, well then, down on my side of the country to say you can't knock blood out of a turnip, well then, that has to be the case.